Today, I'm joined on RCR by Dr. Cameron Murray, Chief Economist at Fresh Economic Thinking and one of Australia's clearest voices on housing, property markets, and economics. I first heard Dr. Murray speak at a conference in Sydney earlier this year, and what immediately stood out to me wasn't just the depth of his knowledge, but the clarity with which he dismantled so many of the myths surrounding Australia's housing market. Housing is one of the most talked about issues in Australia, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. Too often the debate is reduced to emotive headlines and political point scoring instead of sound economics. I'm genuinely grateful that Cameron has taken the time to join me, and I can't wait to discuss some of the many factors that affect housing in Australia. If you don't already, I encourage you to follow Dr. Cameron Murray on X and check out his Substack, Fresh Economic Thinking. Welcome to the show, Cameron.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
My pleasure. Cameron, perhaps we can start at the beginning. We're constantly told by the media, politicians, and a range of so-called experts, including many of our friends and neighbours, often without much context or detail, that we have a housing crisis or a housing affordability crisis. Cameron, there are some big claims thrown around and language matters. How do we define affordable and how do we define a crisis?
This is a great question, and I think we don't reflect enough on what we mean by the words. We get a little bit swept up in what other people are saying. And I usually like to start by zooming out and giving some context. And I like to quote a famous visitor to Australia who noted in their diary that the number of new homes recently built and others building is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house. Right? Famous visitor to Australia in 1836. That's from Charles Darwin's Beagle Diaries, from his first day in Sydney. And so I just kind of got to think, if there's a crisis today, was there a crisis then? Was there a crisis in the 1915 rents inquiry in New South Wales, looking into the problem of rising rents in Sydney? When was there not a crisis? So I think with that context in mind, it's important that we don't get swept up in what's happening right now and think that it's abnormal or unusual, but zoom out and go, we are part of history, where in a normal part of the market, some people are being disadvantaged and some are advantaged when prices rise. It's also true when prices fall. Some people are advantaged and some are disadvantaged. But this idea that there's a crisis, we all agree what it is and we must do something is very shallow and not particularly accurate. Because when prices go up, I can tell you the 6% of households who own their own home and the 18% of households who are investors, that's the value of their asset. Asset values going up, we generally think is a good thing. So there are winners and losers. And when we say crisis, we often mean different things. And so zooming out is always important to get the context right.
I appreciate that, Cameron. It's important that we don't oversimplify these things. The housing market is not an incredibly simple thing. One of those issues that I see, and I've fallen for the trap myself, is comparing house price to income ratios. And I'm one of those who has spread that information in the past, and I'll admit it today. Have we confused the price of housing with the cost of housing? What's the difference, and why does that distinction matter?
Yeah, great question. Measuring price to income ratios is extremely popular in the media, even by economists. And the problem with it is this. You're comparing a stock with a flow, right? So the flow is the income, the annual income of a household, and the stock is the once-off capital purchase price. And the problem is that we have a financial system and a macroeconomy, and we have tools for converting stocks to flows, like mortgages, right? So a mortgage converts a big number, $1 million mortgage, into a smaller flow number, which is the interest that you pay to rent the money. And so when that interest rate changes, and we compare flows with flows, i.e. the interest on a mortgage versus the rent payment or the household income, you get a very different comparison. And it's important to note that that way that we convert capital values into flows, that interest rate, prevails in the whole economy, not just the housing market. So if that's true, then the housing market just can't convert prices, stocks to flows at a different rate to every other part of the economy. And so when we drop interest rates, for example, so during COVID, we dropped interest rates. So say before COVID, you could get a mortgage at 4%. So you could borrow $1 million and pay $40,000 per year interest. You could rent the money, that stock at 40,000 flow. Then during COVID, we dropped interest rates. So now you could borrow $1 million at 20,000, dollars per year rent at a 2% interest rate. So we halved how much it cost in flow terms to borrow the same $1 million, which meant that the capital value had to go up, right? So that the flow of what it costs to rent and what it costs to borrow equalizes in the economy. We did that intentionally because we wanted house prices not to fall, right? And then since COVID, we've intentionally put interest rates up to stop house prices rising and prevent people buying houses. And then we all turn around and say there's a crisis because prices aren't going up, people can't buy houses, there's no turnover. I'm like, well, yeah, that's the point of raising the interest rate, is to prevent people buying houses. And it's true, there's a distributional effect. Some people will be prevented who would have been able to buy at a 2% mortgage that can't buy at a 6% mortgage. But that's not an accident. That's just the outcome of a necessary and intentional action we've taken in Australia and around the world. So I think that context matters. And this is why price to income is a bad metric, because $1 million when mortgages are 6%, it costs you $60,000 per year. And $1 million at 2% costs you 20,000, which is a third, and it's the same price to income ratio, right? So you just can't use that.
Makes a lot of sense. Cameron, I've worked in finance myself for about 12 years, and one of the most common phrases that someone will say to me when they walk in wanting a mortgage is, "Oh, rent money's dead money." I love the way that in your book you explain that we are all renters. Can you elaborate on that concept of us all being renters, whether you're an owner, whether you're a renter, whether you have a mortgage?
Well, I guess the thing is, if you've got a mortgage, you've just substituted renting the house from a landlord for renting the money from a bank and being your own landlord, right? You're just still renting. One is you rent money and convert that money to a house. One is you rent the house directly. So I think people, they misunderstand. If rent money is dead money, so is interest dead money, right? Like it's the same thing. It's not like you get something for it, right? So that's sort of important. If you own your own house, you are sort of always giving up the opportunity to live somewhere else and rent that out, right? As well. So if you've got a house that could rent for $1,000 a week and you're choosing not to get your $1,000 a week and rent somewhere smaller for $500 and take $500 difference, then you're also kind of giving up that rental income as well. So yeah, it's the economics doesn't really change. It's just sort of from what perspective we look at the same arrangement, right? And I don't think a lot of people are clear on that, right? We have some very confusing folk stories about housing. Like you said, rent money's dead money. But I think it's not difficult, I think, especially for people from finance backgrounds, to think quite clearly about it.
Understand. Cameron, in 2021, house prices rose around 24.5% in Australia. Net overseas migration was practically zero, and the RBA cut cash rates to about 0.1%. Mortgage rates were below 2%, even fixed rates for a number of years. I think the RBA gave a term funding facility to the banks of about $188 billion that guaranteed them cheap money for 3 years. People will often say that immigration is the cause of higher prices of houses. I believe 2021 proves that actually most of the increase occurred without migration. It was just cheap credit. Is that true?
Yeah, so migration has an effect on the housing market, as it must,
Hmm.
or if there was no effect, we wouldn't build more houses for more people.
Yep.
But what you're describing during COVID is that the effect on the price, the capital price, the asset value of houses from low interest rates was so much bigger than the effect of migration, which usually comes via rents because new people have to compete to find a place to live, and that can affect rents. So you're describing that, the financial settings of the economy are massively more important than migration when it comes to the level of the capital value of houses, the asset price. Migration's effects are generally temporary, and they generally happen through the rental market. And they kind of have to be temporary, right? Because we've had lots of migration for 2 centuries. And if migration just kept pushing prices up forever and ever, then prices would be, unreachably high by now. But they're not actually. And in fact, people get surprised when I tell them that the typical renter household, whether you take a median or a mean, pays the same share of their income on rent today as they did in 1992 when we did the first survey of income and housing, where we could get a very good read on this data. So we're talking 30 plus years, no increase in rent to income ratio. And that's true in Japan, in Canada, in the United States, in the UK. So what happens is that over the long term, rents do converge to this relatively flat proportion of household spending. But the migration effect is temporary. People move to an area, that area gets higher rents. People start developing more in that area or elsewhere. And over time, that little increase gets smoothed out. So you can see that in the 2010s in Australia. We had a big migration surge during the financial crisis and a little bit after, and rents went up substantially. But then during the 2010s, we had a huge construction boom. And in fact, rents and prices were both falling from about 2015 to the 2021. So rents, as the rental component of CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is our inflation measure, was below, it was rising slower than all the other things like food and insurance and holidays and transport and clothes and stuff like that. Rents were falling. So that migration effect during the financial crisis pushed up rents for a few years. We got a big surge, and then a few years later, they started falling again. So that's sort of how migration affects the housing market, not through huge changes in the asset price, but through moderate or slow changes to rents that adjust over time.
Yeah, that's important context. Now, onto politics, I guess, Cameron. It's housing affordability and the cost of living crisis are words that just roll off the tongues of politicians. And some will say we need more supply, and they just keep punching that line. And I guess what I see in politics is that most voters, most politicians, and most lobby groups own property. They have a vested interest in property prices being maintained, and often they'll focus on first home buyers as the group that they're seeking to sort of advantage over others. What is the consequence of politicians not only being heavily invested in this, but seeking to, I guess, pick winners via the policies that they release on housing? We've got first homeowners grants, construction grants, shared equity schemes, you name it. They keep rolling them out. Is there a consequence to, I guess, a 3-year election cycle and seeking to woo a certain group of voters?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's always been the case. Our first homeowners grants, which are just cash subsidies to new home buyers, began in the 1980s and have been, ramped up and down ever since. We've always given first home buyers discounts on stamp duty, for example. And so, yeah, that's not particularly new. And I don't have a philosophical problem with politicians seeking to advantage some groups over others. That's fine. The net effect of all that is that, first, the home ownership rate in Australia has been surprisingly stable given how many crises we've apparently had in the last 40 years. it actually peaked in the early 70s, a touch over 70%, and it's 66% in the last census, which was 2021. And we're having a census next month in August 2026, which will tell us whether it's gone up or down since 2021. And the funny thing is, in around 2020, I predicted that the home ownership rate in Australia would go up when the census data comes out from 2016 to 2021. So they're the two census years. That was, and everyone was saying, no way, that's impossible. We're having a crisis. But they sort of didn't look at the data. First home buying mortgage data we can look at, and we can see a big jump in 2017. So after the Royal Commission, then banks repriced their mortgages to give homeowners an interest rate advantage over investors. And so we saw a jump then. And then during COVID, we saw record high first home buying. We had something like 180,000 per year for 2 years, when the 5 years prior, including this 2017 period, was something like 90,000 a year. So we sort of squeezed four years of first home buying into 2 years during COVID. And the last census caught some of that, and I think the next census will catch some more of that. And so it might go up again. And everyone's going to just dismiss the data and still panic because, you know, panicking together with your friends seems to be one of the hobbies most people have. So anyway, I don't think there's a huge issue with targeting first home buyers. There's a big idea that if you give first home buyers money, you know, you structurally increase the price of houses, because if you give everyone $50,000 to buy a home, everyone can outbid each other by $50,000 more and the price goes up. That's not strictly true, because first home buyers aren't the whole market, and we can exhaust those buyers pretty quickly. First home buyers are around a fifth of the market. And so most trading happens with upgrader buyers and investors. And so, yeah, that price effect can happen as first home buyers become price setting, but there's a limited number of them, and so that effect can only be temporary. So yeah, there's a lot of subtle things that don't quite match what you'll hear in the mainstream press when it comes to these policy settings.
No, thanks, Cameron. That's important context. Now, if we go back to when a commercial bank issues a new mortgage, there is new money created in the system, right? So we have a system where our monetary supply expands as more credit is issued and less credit is repaid, because we're usually issuing more loans than what are repaid. Is there a link between, I guess, the rapid expansion of money, the massive uptake of home ownership in the last few years, especially during COVID, and the inflation that we feel every day? We have more money in circulation. Does that flow through potentially, at least in the short term?
Yeah, I think the inflation spike after COVID is very much related to the, I guess, money printing, the combined efforts of private monetary expansion from new mortgages and new borrowing, and government money expansion from subsidies and the fiscal settings. And that was true globally. So every country kind of did similar things, and that's why we've had a very surprising but globally similar inflation spike since COVID that is really coming down relatively slowly in most places, because those settings are hard to reverse, because you have to stop paying someone who thinks, you know, whose livelihood is now built around this extra flow of public money. So yeah, that was definitely the case. I would say that was a classic case of inflation due to monetary expansion, both private money through mortgages and public money. And I think in 20 years, it'll be in the economics textbooks as the most perfect case, right? And the politics of winding that back will be quite difficult. And I think to your broader point about inflation, I think a lot of the public conversation in the last few years has essentially been about inflation, but without acknowledging it. This cost of living crisis, you've heard about that one too, right?
Plenty of times.
Again, that's just inflation, right? We're just not used to it. And the housing crisis, well, yeah, if we've had 35% inflation in 5 or 6 years, then rents should go up 35% to just keep in line with all the other goods and services in the economy. And so, yeah, a lot of what we've been talking about politically in the last couple of years is just, I think, an emergent result of people's confusion. They see the price of things they want to buy, houses, goods and services, supermarket goods, go up, and they think, well, I'm not responsible for that, so that's someone else's problem. They made the prices go up. And then they see their incomes go up, and they go, well, that wasn't someone else. That wasn't inflation. That was me. That was my efforts because I'm a great guy and I know how to get a pay rise. Whereas both of those effects are just reflective of general inflation. But we have this asymmetric view of who's responsible for which side. And that was true in the 70s, right? We had a big spike in inflation. So in Brisbane, where I live, in the early 70s, home prices went up 100% and inflation went up 40% in 3 years. And that was what happened after COVID as well. We had sort of 30% inflation and 90% home price increases. So very, very similar economic effects.
Cameron, I grew up in a asbestos-clad prefab home on a farm in the middle of nowhere. Our house is pretty basic. It had a light in every room and no fans, no air conditioning, all of those things. I feel like part of this so-called housing affordability crisis is our expectations on what sort of home we believe that we can buy up front. My wife and I, we bought a unit, we cleared most of that debt, then we upgraded to a house eventually. Would it be true to say that our expectations of the house that we think we can buy as a first home buyer have actually increased beyond economic reality with the emergence of a 30-year mortgage, now sometimes a 40-year mortgage up front for a big fancy home, and also a national construction code that requires 7-star energy rating and those sorts of things? Is there issues around expectations and potentially also the standards of housing in Australia? You can't buy a cheap home?
Well, I mean, you can buy old, crappy homes, but they're not cheap either. So you can buy a home that's a low construction standard, but if it's in a good place, it's not going to be cheap. So look, so I think there's two questions there. One is about sort of the psychology and cultural expectations around housing and how that interacts with the economic reality. And the second part is about, actual cost of construction and bigger, better homes versus smaller homes. I think on the first point, you're basically right. And I think a more subtle view on that is that we have in mind a sort of rank order of who is worthy and lives in nice suburbs and who is unworthy and doesn't. And at the top, we have people who did the right thing and went to university and got their law degree or their whatever, and they deserve nice things. And at the bottom, we have, that guy's a mechanic or a tradie or whatever, okay? And we have this hidden assumption about the rank of deservingness in society. But what's actually happened in the last 20 years is that has been totally sort of mixed around. So you got a lot of wealthy tradies and running their own businesses, and you got a lot of university graduates with pretty average jobs who think they deserve better and deserve to live in the nice suburb and are getting very frustrated by it because they think they did the right thing, but they're not at the position in the rank they expect to be. So that's my interpretation of a lot of the general frustration. On terms of the quality and size and the construction cost, like our houses are, as you say, much better than when we grew up, right? I remember getting an air conditioner in one room and it was the greatest thing ever. And it was like when I was in year 12. Had never had an air conditioner before. And if it was hot at night, the whole family would just go and sleep on the floor in that one room because it was like the most amazing new thing. So yeah, our houses are bigger and better than ever. And I think that's fine. Like a rich country should have bigger and better houses than a poor country. And we're a richer country now. The important thing to remember though, is that the price of houses the asset price is not the same as the construction cost.
Hmm.
And here's the thing, when we get richer, we choose to use that wealth not to have more houses necessarily, but to have bigger, better, higher quality finishes, though higher density houses. And yes, they cost more to construct, but we're willing to pay the extra for those extra rooms. So what you find is the result of this is that if I was a property developer doing a subdivision and I thought, oh, well, there's a housing crisis, what I'll do is I'll build the simplest, cheapest homes I can and sell them, I will probably make less money than building really fancy, much more expensive to construct homes because the buyers are simply willing to pay for it because we're rich. And I think that is the confusion. House prices are expensive because we're rich. Construction costs are expensive because we want all the fancy things and can pay for it because we're rich. And the issues people have is they are not as rich as they think in the income rank. Especially at the age they think, given that the whole population is slightly older now, 30 years old is not the same as 30 years old 40 years ago, right? So I've done some analysis on fresh economic thinking, for example, that although the age of first home buyers has increased by 5 years in the last 40 years, so from 27 to 32, the number of full-time work years a couple has done before they buy a house is the same. The thing is, we've squeezed 5 more years of study in on average and just delayed our whole life 5 years. That includes getting married, buying a house, working, all of those things. But if everyone left school at 15 and started working, home ownership rate would go up because the age of first home buying would go down. But we choose not to. We choose to spend those years studying to get the higher incomes later and buy the house later and get a bigger one.
Well said. Cameron, in the commercial property market, we talk yields. When you're buying a commercial property, you'll want a certain yield. I'm a bit old school. I like a path to 10%. Some are willing to pay 5% nowadays. Is that dissimilar to the residential market, or do we just not talk in that language? And is the same ratio relatively true for residential as well?
It's exactly true. So the yield is just the first year's income divided by the price you pay for the asset. So if you get $50,000 of rent and pay $1 million, you get a 5% yield.
Mm-hmm.
And that yield has to, as I mentioned earlier about converting capital values to flows, that's what that kind of yield represents. And people will pay a lower yield if they expect rising capital values and rising rents in the future because you take less now to get more later. And if we expect flat rents or falling rents and declining prices, we expect a higher yield now because it's going to get worse. Housing is exactly like that. So what you'll find is that once rents stop rising, people won't accept such a low yield for their house. Remember, a third of the property market is investors, right? So they're out there trading and setting the price as well. And when their rents start falling, they'll stop buying because they think, oh, well, why would I buy this asset when I can buy other assets where the income's rising over time? If I'll have to wait till the yield gets better, and the yield gets better by the price falling. So yes, it is the same. And it has really surprised me how little this concept gets airplay, even though if you go to property investor conferences and things like that, everyone's about the yield. Should I buy in a country town to get the higher yield? Well, I'm getting the higher risk as well, right? And we know in finance, higher risk means you need a higher return. The property investor conferences, they talk about it, but the media conversation and about is housing affordable, etc., completely ignores it. And you're right, it's a very strange situation.
I think it's more convenient for the media to run with the price to income ratio. It's more dramatic, and as we know with the media, if it bleeds, it leads. So that's going to be the headline that people read. Cameron, if you could convince Australians to abandon just one myth about housing economics, what would it be?
That we have some major structural shortage of houses caused by regulations about what we build where. we have more, bigger, better houses than any point in human history. Well, we did 4 years ago. We've had a bit of an adjustment since the borders reopened, but I reckon in another couple of years we'll be through that adjustment and be back to biggest, best houses per person in history. And the reason I say this is I say this. I could go back to 1980, right? The headlines in 1980 also said, housing shortage responsible for housing crisis, right? Just go to Trove, which is the federal government library's online archive. Pick any year in history and look for housing shortage, and apparently we had one, okay? So if I got in my time machine from 2026 and went back to 1980 and explained to people, oh, yeah, there's only 2.5 people per house. You guys have 4 people per house. Oh, and our houses are twice as big now. Oh, they're air conditioned. We have dishwashers, washing machines, you name it. Oh, there's this thing called the internet, magic electronic information service, mobile, you name whatever we have. The number of garages, the outdoor lighting, the pools, the tennis courts. We've got more of it than ever and fewer people living in any house. And if I went back in time to 1980 and explain to people, this is what the future's like, they would say, oh, wow, you must have solved, housing must be so cheap. You've got such abundant, enormous houses. You guys are so rich. You must be so happy with all the housing outcomes. And you say, actually, no, the newspapers are basically the same as they are now. I could cut and paste word for word and people wouldn't even know that I cut and paste the 1980 headline. And they would be confused because they would think, hang on, isn't the shortage the problem? If we have more, bigger, better houses, doesn't that solve it? And then I come from the future and say, yeah, we've done that and everyone's still unhappy. So that's sort of the biggest myth. And I think it brings it back to housing is all about equality and expectations and where you are in that income rank, right? And so what's happened around the world since COVID is that everyone's incomes have shifted, but some people's haven't shifted the average. They've shifted less than the average. And if that's you, if you're getting left behind on the income side when there's inflation, you still have to pay on the expenses side for those now inflated prices. And that reshuffling of people's incomes and ranks, I think, is very socially disruptive and causes a lot of confusion and anxiety and hence a housing crisis. And it was always thus. In the 1870s, one of the most popular German language pamphlets was called The Housing Question by Friedrich Engels, musing about the problems of access to housing in the industrial cities of Europe during high economic growth periods. Same thing in the 1970s, same thing after COVID as well.
Cameron, too often we turn to government to solve our problems in this world. I believe I'm a big believer in us actually taking more personal responsibility as individuals. What can we do other than educating ourselves and gaining some context around this issue to sort of step out of that cycle of fear and dependence and sort of, gain a more rational understanding around issues like this?
Yeah, look, I guess I'm not so skeptical. If you read my book, I do look historically, and it's quite interesting because prior to the Second World War, home ownership in Australia was very low, 40% in the cities, much higher in the regions, because after the First World War, we gave lots of land to soldiers who, there was a big boost then. A lot of it didn't persist because the land was, not really suitable to farm and set up, but it was actually the Commonwealth state housing agreements after the Second World War that actually got home ownership from 40% to 71% by 1970. And that was essentially the government subsidizing and building houses for people who didn't own houses. And that's true in Singapore. It's true in a lot of countries that's what created the home owning society. So I'm not super skeptical, but I'm sort of skeptical of avoiding direct action and doing sort of pretend actions instead. Like the Housing Future Fund is a little bit like, wow, okay, what are we achieving here? If our problem is some people we think should own homes don't own homes, and we're not putting them in homes as directly as possible. I'm like, well, you clearly don't know what your problem is because you're not directly solving the problem you've defined. Your problem is people are upset. And so you're going, oh, we've done something. You're upset. I'm doing something to deal with you being upset. Does it achieve anything? That's incidental because that's not the intended outcome. So I think we could definitely, and what I propose in The Great Housing Hijack, my book, is if we could agree on what the problem is and that we wanted higher home ownership for people who can't afford to live in certain places, we would just do what we did historically and we would build and subsidize people into them. But I think we're at the point now where we think that's actually too unfair. Because if I've just bought a house in my street for $1 million and the government's developed something at the other end of the street and is letting people live there for, $700,000, I'll be like, hey, what gives? Why do they get to live my lifestyle cheaper than me? And that's always the issue with non-market allocation and government allocation is we've got to agree on a fair way to do it. And price, we all agree, is fair. So you can definitely do that. We've done it historically. But yeah, I think we have to accept the reality that despite the headlines we see, no one agrees what the crisis is. And that's why we're not really doing anything effective besides talking a lot and doing somewhat minor tweaks to, we'll give a little bit more first homeowners grant here. We'll give a little bit more of a stamp duty subsidy there. We'll do this investment fund through this sort of elaborate subsidy mechanism, and then hopefully people will be able to rent for a little bit less here. I mean, yeah, fine, do it all, but that's almost indicative to me that you don't really know. You haven't really thought through what is the crisis, what do we actually really care about, what outcome do we think is detrimental that we want to change? All this sort of stuff suggests we don't really know that question yet, but we want to make sure we're looking like we're doing something. And that, for me, is very frustrating. I've even asked politicians. I had a phone call with a politician because I said, hey, if your problem is this, why don't you just build public housing, right? We should look after people who we want to live in the cities who really, can't look after themselves very well. And that politician said to me, where's the market failure? The housing market's doing what we wanted. I don't see any problem here. We lowered interest rates during COVID, prices went up, we increased them. Everyone's upset because it's expensive to buy or to borrow money to buy. It's exactly what we want. I'm like, whoa, okay, that's very honest. Hang up the phone, see them on TV saying, oh, there's a housing crisis, everything's wrong, the market's failing, we need to do something. I'm like, how fake is this? How fake is it? So I think the reality is it is true that in 2026, it is an expensive time to buy a house to live in because mortgage rates have risen in the last couple of years while prices have continued to rise. So you're paying a lot more to borrow money to be a homeowner than you're paying to rent. But this was true before the financial crisis. It was true before the 1990s recession, and the market always adjusts through this period. And there will be a cheap time to buy again in the future, just like there was in 2017 to 2019, one of the cheapest times to buy in the last 30 years. There will be a time like that again. We are just in a cycle. Some people, unfortunately, are at the age where they really want to buy right now, and it's not a great time. But that's kind of how the market works, and we need to acknowledge that before we start trying to intervene and tweak things.
Cameron, thank you so much for challenging me personally. I really appreciate your work. I love reading something new that challenges the preconceived ideas I had. I'm not formally educated in economics, but I follow it relatively closely. And I just want to thank you for your book and for your Substack and all of your work on X. It's great to see a public face and voice out there that's challenging the status quo, challenging the politics of it, and just backing that up with history, context, and economics. So thank you for joining me on RCR, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Thanks for having me, Michael.